What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today's video is going to be an absolute beginner crash course in C#. So to get started with C#, you're going to want to install an IDE, an integrated development environment, and the one I'll be using for this tutorial series, and I really recommend this one, is Microsoft Visual Studio. To get to it, just Google Visual Studio download, take the link that'll take you to Microsoft.com, and for this installation, you can either download Visual Studio, make sure you grab Community Edition so you don't have to pay for it, it's totally free, or you can just hit this download Visual Studio with .NET. If you do the community download, then there's going to be a whole bunch of options, and you have to select some things to make sure you get the right type. After you download Visual Studio, it's going to ask you what kind of install you want, and just make sure you select the one that says .NET Framework, because that's what we'll be using for C#. So once you have it downloaded and installed, you're going to click on Visual Studio to get it to open, and just create a new project. It gives you all these options because Visual Studio has like 100 gigabytes worth of plugins and different applications you can run through it. But what we're going to be using is Console App with .NET Framework. So there are so many options that there's actually even two called Console Application. So make sure you grab the one with .NET Framework so that you can follow along in this tutorial. So hit next, give it a name. We'll call this C# Crash Course. Call it whatever you want. And just hit create. And what you're going to notice once it loads up is there's a little bit of pre-populated code, and you're going to see it says using system and then a whole bunch of add-ins after that. Don't worry about these too much. They're essentially modules accessing things inside of your computer so that the code can run. Just leave it as is. It needs to be there, but you don't really need to know what it means for this tutorial. And then kind of the same with this Solution Explorer over on the right. There's a whole bunch of things in there, properties, references. As we get more into C#, we'll talk about what a lot of those do. But all you really need to recognize for today is this C# file is given the same name you just gave your project. And you'll notice over here on the left, your namespace is also the name of the project you just gave it. And this auto-populated class is really just a location to put functional code inside of it. We'll really nail down a description as we get more into the tutorials, but I just want to get you guys programming as fast as possible. And then this static void main is a method and a function where you're going to put code as well. But all you really need to know for now is every time there's an open and close curly brackets, that's essentially the start of and end of a code module. And for getting started, you want to just put all of the functional code inside of your main function. You'll notice the indentation is going to be pretty much automatic for you, so you don't have to worry about syntax. Just make sure it's inside the curly brackets underneath static void main, and we'll write all of our code for this tutorial inside of main, okay? So the very first thing I want to do is just get something displayed on the console. If this is the first programming language that you've ever seen and somehow the first tutorial that you've ever watched, welcome, and be sure to like and subscribe for more content. But you're probably familiar with the fact the first program that people always write is basically a hello world program where they just print hello world onto the screen. That's kind of boring, so we'll, instead of writing hello world, we'll write like what is freaking up, because that's way cooler. But I want to talk about this line of code because there's a few things going on here, C# specific, that we should really discuss. So console is how you address the window that's going to pop up. It's the console is sort of referred to as like the command window. If you're completely unfamiliar with computers, a console window is basically the lowest level, just simple display that you can get out of your computer. There's not a lot going on. It's black and white typically. It's just plain text. And so console.writeLine is all you need to put in to get something to display on a window when you run your program. But what you'll see, so console.writeLine, and then open parentheses, close parentheses, and then any text that you put inside of quotation marks is going to display on the screen. And then make sure anytime you have a line, so this is basically like a a little executable. It's an instruction. Anytime you want to end an instruction, you need to make sure you put a semicolon at the end of the line. You're going to get errors if you don't put those in. C# and Visual Studio is pretty good about helping you debug and troubleshoot errors. So if you forget a semicolon, a lot of the times you'll get a little error pop up that says like semicolon expected. You're going to forget about semicolons. People who have been programming for years forget semicolons, so don't worry about it. Just try to keep that in mind. But so this is all we need to display something on the screen, but what you'll see if I go up here and I hit start, and it's going to do something called compiling, which is making sure your code is valid, and then it's going to run, but what you saw there, maybe you didn't, the console pops up just for like one scan of the computer, and then it goes away right away because it's executing the code. And then it as far as it can tell, it's done. So what we need to do is just put kind of a break in this code by adding console.readline, and then we'll just do open and close parentheses and then a semicolon. And now when we run this, I'll talk a little bit about what that does. Okay, we got our text. What is freaking up? That's sweet. So that's cool. That's basically our Hello World program. And what it's doing right now, you can see the blinking inside of our console window. It's waiting for some sort of text, so I type whatever in here, and then when I hit enter, it's going to execute and then read that line, and that's when the window closes. So we used this read line to add a break to the programming, but this is super useful anytime you want to slow down a program and understand where it is at the moment. You just hit, you put a console.readline in there, and that'll put a break in your programming. Okay, so that's sweet. That's your first function. You've downloaded Visual Studio and gotten programming in like 5 minutes. So great job. Let's go to the next thing. Let's start doing something kind of cool. A lot of tutorials will stop right there and be like, oh, you learned Visual Studio, like you learned C#. Let's actually do something useful. So I want to talk real quick. I'm going to copy this console write line, and we're going to change the text, but I want to talk a little bit about the order it goes in. So I'm going to put like 3 different fruits in here so that you can see apple, banana, and then orange. So hopefully, if you're familiar with English and how we read in society, we go left to right and top to bottom, and that's how C# executes as well. So if I run this, you'll see apple first, banana second, orange third. So order matters. And what I mean by that is like if I'm gonna copy orange and move it up to the top, and then I run this, you're gonna see orange before apple and banana now. So this order is also how it's going to execute. So if you ever write code where like something happening down here needs to see something has completed up here, order is really important. It's going to give you an error if you try to like reference a variable that doesn't get created until later in your program. That's kind of a universal truth of programming. So even if you learn other languages, if you learn Python, it's exactly the same. Java, it doesn't matter. If you try to reference a variable on a line before you have instantiated, called, defined, whatever the verbiage of that language is, if you haven't created a variable, you're not going to be able to use it yet. So that's cool. We've written multiple lines of code. We've got a break in there so that we can read about it. But let's start using variables. I just referenced variables, just talking about them, and that's a super important thing in all programming, especially C#. To use variables is going to give you some flexibility. So let's say you wanted to create a little Mad Libs. That's your name is Pete. Your age is 25, and then we'll say third line, but next year you will be 26. Okay, like, yeah, I can enter these manually, but that's not a very robust program. What would be a lot better is if I had a variable for my name. So we'll make, to make a variable, you enter the data type, and we'll talk a little bit about data types in a second. But name is going to be a string. So you type in the word string, and then you type the name of your variable, which in this case is going to be name, and then you give it an initial value. So for a string, we'll say name is going to be equal to Pete. and make sure you've got your semicolon. And then we will say for age, but age is going to be a whole number. So that's integer, which is just int in C#. And then we'll say age, and that's equal to, and you don't need quotations when you're doing integers. It's going to recognize the number format, okay? So now, instead of your name is Pete, we're going to say your name is space, and then we're going to use this plus sign, which is, it's technically addition, but in string terms, this is called concatenation. And so we're basically saying your name is plus, and then the name of the variable we gave it. So we don't have to type in the whole string name equal Pete. We just say name. And then it's the exact same thing for age. And this is one difference between like Python and C# and C++. In C#, it can concatenate a string with a integer or decimal value just by it's able to convert that. It's able to handle that internally. If this was Python, you'd have to do a string conversion so that you're only dealing with strings. You can leave this in here just as an integer. But then this is a super cool thing. Now, in the middle of our program, we can just say age equals the previous value of age plus 1. And now we can say right here, next year you will be plus age. And this is going to do basically exactly what we need it to do. It's always going to give you the value. And see, I already forgot semicolon. This is always going to give you a value saying next year you will be your age plus 1. And you could make this a new variable. You could say like new age equals age plus 1. You'd have to do the whole gambit just like this. But because order matters, we can have it work both ways. We can just say age equals age plus 1. And so this is going to tell us we're 25, and then it's going to add 1 to it. And then next year you'll be 26. So if I go ahead and run this, and you run yours, you're going to see your name is Pete, your age is 25, next year you'll be 26. Okay, let's do someone else. Let's say your name is Jack, and you're 27. Okay, so all I did was change 2 values, and right away the whole thing updates to be correct. Your name's Jack, 27, next year will be 28. So that's the power of variables, and this is kind of a silly example because there's not really a value in Mad Libs, but in general, anytime you store value in a variable, it's because you want to keep using it, you want to manipulate it throughout your program. And it's a lot easier to store that somewhere than have to keep in mind what it was and hard code it. So that's super useful. That's kind of a brief introduction to variables. But let's say we want this to be a little more intuitive, and I don't want to have to change these values initially. I want to ask the user for input because right now all we're really doing is providing output to the system. What we're going to do is make it where we ask the user for that name and for that age. And this is going to be great because essentially the core of programming is get user input, process the input, and then display some output using the inputs that you got. So we're going to do all of that inside this function in just a few minutes. So instead of just doing this string name equals and then just entering a value, what we're going to do is give them some instructions. So we'll use this console.writeLine, and we'll say parentheses enter your name, and we'll put that on one line, and then we'll go ahead and close that semicolon. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use, and you've actually already seen the console.readLine function because we've used it before. Make sure you get your indentations correct. But what we do here is we say string name equals, and instead of giving it an initial value, what we're going to do is use console.readLine, okay? So this is really cool. Now we're going to say enter your name, and then the little blinker, the thing signifying you're entering text, is just going to sit there until the user types in their name and hits enter. And we're going to take whatever the user entered and we're going to store it in a variable called name that we'll then use later on. So this is an important point here. ReadLine is always going to take whatever was written in as a string. So if the next thing we want to do, I'm going to go ahead and copy this, but we're going to change it to age. So right line, enter your, and this time we will say age. Now, it's still going to be int age equals, but we can't just take console.readLine. I wish we could, but we have to convert it to an integer because it's coming in as a string. And that's why you're going to get like a red squiggly line if you just leave it like this, because it's telling you it can't just implicitly convert string to integer. It has to be told to convert it. Fortunately, that's a super easy function in C#. You just use convert dot, and then this in particular, we're going to an integer. And so the function is toInt32. It's 32 because of how many Booleans technically in binary that are used in an integer value. You don't have to worry about that. You just have to know it's toInt32. And then put that console.readLine, that whole block of code, put it inside its own set of parentheses. And now the user's not going to notice any difference between entering their name and entering their age. It's just the code now knows to handle that as an integer, and then everything else is going to work just fine. So let's go ahead and run this. Let's say enter your name. Let's do Pete. Enter your age, 25. Your name is Pete. Your age is 25. Next year you'll be 26. Let's go ahead and close it. Let's run it again. Give it some different values. We're Jack. We're 27. Your name's Jack, you're 27, next year you'll be 28. So just like that, we've created our first program, our first function, our first variables, everything inside of 15 minutes, and hopefully you understand where all this code is coming from. I know we haven't covered some of the concepts of like structure of the project, structure of the file, but you're already able to pull a variety of information in from users, manipulate it inside of your program, and then output data based on what you got. So this is a crazy useful speed tutorial. You learn a lot of concepts right here in 15 minutes. I'll touch on one more thing before we end this initial tutorial, because you've seen integers and you've seen strings, and we didn't really talk a ton about them. We basically just said integers are whole numbers like an age, and string is any combination of text. But let's just talk briefly about two things. So first, adding comments to code in Python. I just used forward slashes, but you do 2 backslashes, and you can type whatever you want after that. 2 forward slashes is going to mean whatever else is on that rung, on that line of code, isn't going to get executed. They're just notes for the programmer. They live inside of the function. So everything I'm about to put underneath here is just for our data type discussion. It's not really useful code, but this is how you do comments, okay? So that's a super useful general piece about C# you should know. And we've already seen that integers are basically any whole number, like 100 or 120. We've already seen that strings are basically any text. So you could have names or I don't know, other text or other things. Okay, but those are probably the 2 most common ones you'll see. But a few others that really pop up a lot in programming are a double. So I'll talk briefly about, there's a variety of ways to have decimal point values, and they could be in double, float, or what's called decimal format. And I'm not going to go too into each of them. Just know that it kind of is like, how precise do you need it? Float, technically speaking, is the least precise. Decimal is technically the most, I believe. But just in general, I always use double for decimal points. So basically, if you have a number like money, like you want to be really accurate with money. So someone owes you $345.35. I would always put that in a double. Okay, that's just another really common variable. One that maybe you're not used to if you don't do a lot of programming or you haven't in the past is what's considered a Boolean. But if you think of all the scenarios in code where you have an on-off or a true-false, yes-no type scenario where you're just checking if something is or is not active, this is also sometimes called discrete points or digital points. Those are just all different names for it. But the variable type that you're going to use, the data type, is Boolean. And so Boolean, which I'll say is going to be true, false, can only have two values, true, like that, or false, like that. And it's a super useful thing in coding. It's way easier than creating an integer and then checking every time you want to reference it if it's equal to a 0 or a 1 or something like that, or a string and checking if it's equal to the text true or the text false. Just use this type of variable. It's super critical in programming, and you're really going to want to get familiar with Booleans. One more that's a little bit less common is a character. And so this is like a single letter or a single number that you wanted to put into a variable of exactly space 1, but it could be a varying character. So you could think of like a grade, like A, B, C, D, F in the grade system, and you actually use single quotations for these ones. So you could put an A here, it could be lower, it could be upper, it could be a number. But a character is only going to be able to house one character, and if you put multiple in, it's going to give you an error. So that's character. You won't see that one as much, but it is nice to know that it's out there. There are some other data types that will probably crop up as we do more and more of these tutorials, but for now, those are the most common ones that are going to pop up in your tutorials, in your programs. But in general, this is really a 20-minute crash course that should give you a ton of concepts that are going to get used in C# all the time. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video. Helps me out a ton. If there's something specific you want to see in a future video, be sure to let me know about in the comments below. I'll get back to you as soon as possible, and it might even make that concept into a video. So thank you so much for your support. Good luck with your code, and thanks for watching. Thanks. Bye.